Laura from Beth's Creative Stitchery. This video is going to be how to sew a kimono style sleeve. Now that may seem like a simple matter, but actually one of the problems that lies with sewing this type of sleeve is often the instructions are a very sketchy roadmap. It would be like asking, how do you get to Canada? And somebody says, well, just go north. Well, that's right, just go north. But the problem is, you probably want to know a little bit more detail, like what roads to take, how long is it going to take, and that's the problem with most instructions on how to do a kimono style sleeve. Most pattern companies have a very short paragraph on how to do this, and usually consists of about 3 sentences, and then it's really up to you to figure out how to navigate this corner, and when you're all done, to have it turn out nice and have it all overcasted and have a nice 90-degree angle in the corner. You might ask yourself, how hard could it possibly be to sew in a square sleeve? And the problem is, it's this junction point right here where all the seams come together. It's harder to get that nice and flat and overcasted without having to get in there and put a clip in there. So this is the basic anatomy of a kimono sleeve. The sleeve itself is pretty much square. It may have a little bit of shaping along here, but the whole sleeve arm side itself tends to be straight. The patterns usually have a series of dots on the sleeve that also correspond to a series of dots on the pattern itself. This is the back of the pattern. Doesn't matter whether we're looking at the back or the front. We also have our shoulder seam, and it's this junction right here which is the root of our problem. So this is a perfect example of the type of instructions that you would find in a standard commercial pattern. And usually this is one picture right here that tells you here's that very important dot. And they give you one paragraph that tells you how to sew it together that basically consists of 3 sentences. I have seen some private label pattern companies have you navigate this seam by coming up to the intersection, coming across at an angle, and then going straight down. When you turn the garment to the right side, what you're going to end up with is a gigantic pucker on both sides. It's actually practically large enough to stick your cell phone into. The other thing I've seen is that they would have you come across, get to the point, and then sew straight down. All of this, once again, being done in one step. That will cause the same problem. Some people also think by just going around and curving it is the way to sew this. The reality of it is all 3 of these methods would require you to get in there and put clips. And while you're doing that, you might as well just end up just making a raglan sleeve. So those methods just don't work. The proper way to do this is, if you put the dot where the pattern company tells you to, you're going to do this in basically 3 steps. First step is you're going to sew the sleeve to the front back body, and you're going to stop at the dot. Then you are going to sew the side seams, the back and front side seams, starting at the dot and proceeding down until you get to the bottom. Then you are going to sew the underarm of the sleeve, and that would be the proper way to do this. What I'm going to show you is how do you navigate in this particular corner. So for the purpose of the sewing sample, I am going to be using some gray lining fabric, and the serging stitch will be done in black. And all of the sewing steps will be done in a variety of different colors, so you can distinguish one step from another. So the very first thing that you're going to do is you are going to overcast your shoulder seams of your back and front piece, and you're going to sew it together, and you're going to press the seam open. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to then serge or overcast what is basically the side seam, shoulder seam. And you're going to serge that from the bottom of the hem from the back to the front or vice versa, just depending upon what direction you're going. And as a general rule of thumb, whenever I overcast anything, I also try to overcast with what I call is the rightest most side up. And what I mean by that is when I serge this, I am going to serge this. This was my front side of my fabric. I would put, this would be my top looper thread. I would be looking at this side of the fabric when I overcast. And the reason why is your top stitch, your blue looper on your serger tends to be the nicest looking stitch. So ultimately this stitch is going to be, this seam is going to be flipped up and it's going to lay in this position when it's all done. And this way I will have the prettiest stitch. Also, if you don't have enough of the same color of thread, you can put your main color on your blue looper and then match up your other colors with a like type color. Now, if you don't have a serger and you do garment construction, I really feel like you're missing out. There's one type of sewer that really takes a lot of benefit from a serger, and that is a garment constructor. The next thing that you're going to do is you're going to take your sleeve and you are going to overcast the side seams, both of the side seams, and if you want to, you can also do the hem at this time. It's not necessary. As a general rule of thumb, I almost never pre-overcast anything before I sew the seam together, unless it's a kimono sleeve. Then I will do it ahead of time because it makes doing the corner much, much easier. On the top of most sleeves, there's almost always a dot that indicates where you're going to line up the pattern with the shoulder seam. Most of the time, I will always clip in the front clip and the back clip. And the front is always designated with one arrow. The back is always designated with 2. But on a kimono sleeve, I'm not going to worry about it. The only reason I might put these clips in is if my fabric had possibly a lot of stretch in it. But otherwise, I'm not really going to worry about those. But I am going to take and I am going to clip in. I've already done it. I usually don't take this type of clip. I will just usually take my scissors and just nip it in. I just wanted you to be able to see that I've nipped that in. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to line up the clip that you put in the top of the sleeve. You're going to line it up with the shoulder seam. And you're going to put a few pins in there. And of course you are doing this with right sides together. Normally when I make a kimono, I am going to use most of the time a rayon batik fabric. And the problem with rayon batik is that it's often very difficult to tell the right side from the wrong side. And that's why I recommend when you overcast your fabric that you overcast on the rightest most side, because then I don't have to look or mark the fabric. Usually I might mark it with an X with a chalk, or take a pin and put a safety pin in it to mark the right or the wrong side. But this way I know which is the right or wrong side, because the right side of the serging is going to be on the right side of the fabric. So I'm going to pin my sleeve in all the way from front to back, and then I'll be ready for the next step. So for this first step, I am going to put in a dot. The pattern would tell you to place this dot, and it would be about 5/8 of an inch from the edge of the sleeve and 5/8 inch as your seam allowance. Now for this method, I normally don't bother to put in a dot because my foot happens to be 5/8 inch from the needle to the back. So I can actually start forward a little bit, stitch backwards until my foot lines up with the sleeve, and I can stitch forward. But for the sake of demonstration, and I will put this dot in on occasion, I'm going to go ahead and put a dot about right there with my marker. Let it bleed in there a little bit. So you can see what this dot is going to do, and you can also see what I'm going to call my termination point. I have started a little bit ahead of the dot so that I can do a back stitch. My fabric is lined up on my 5/8 inch seam allowance, and I will stitch backwards until I get to the dot, or I can also watch the back of my presser foot. And now that I've seen the back of my presser foot, I can see the dot in the stitch hole of my foot. I'm going to sink the needle, and then I'm going to reline up and sew forward. The thread that I'm going to be using for this step is black. As I approach the bottom, I am also going to make sure that I stop 5/8 inch from the bottom of my sleeve. So if I were to use my seam gauge, I could also mark a dot there. I'm going to go ahead and do that so you can see where I am going to stop. I'm going to mark approximately 5/8 inch seam allowance and then 5/8 inch up from the sleeve. I'm going to stop about right there and make that a little bit darker. Now, normally you would put these dots in beforehand, but I'm only putting them in so for demonstration purposes. I'm going to sew forward, stop at the dot, and actually if you were to look very closely, you would notice I'm really not stopping on the dot, but that's not the point. I'm now going to stitch backwards and take my fabric out, and I'm going to clip my threads. I'm going to show you the next step using my teaching sample because I neglected to make a video clip of it. After you sew the very first seam that you sew the sleeve onto the front and the back of your kimono, you are then going to trim away the seam allowance, about 1/3 of the seam allowance. Once you trim that away, your serging stitch or your other overcasting will then be exposed. After you trim it away, you will then overcast that raw edge using a running stitch, and there'll be more detail about this in the rest of the video. The next thing you're going to do is trim away about 1/3 of the seam allowance from the sleeve piece. Leave the edge that is serged. In fact, just make sure that the serging is exposed. My next step is to overcast that seam. I went ahead and did that, but the most important thing is where you overcast. You're going to make sure that you start the overcasting lined up with the same place where you started your sewing seam. We're going to be using a running stitch for this particular step because it has multiple little stitches within the stitch itself, and this is going to help give you a nice flat seam all the way down the seam allowance. So once you get to the bottom, you are going to stop at about the same point that you stopped your seam. Do not let either one of these seams go into the sleeve seam allowance. After you get done with the overcasting, you will then go to the end of the sleeve piece, the sleeve seam allowance. You are going to flip it up and you're going to pin it back. We need to pin this back so that we can keep the seam allowance out of the way as we sew the next step. You will see these pins in position in the video clips from this point forward. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to match our side seams, making sure that we're right sides together. I know that this is the right side because, once again, the serging stitch is on the rightmost side of the fabric. We're going to match the point. Actually, we're going to just match where the stitching ended with the other side. Oop. We're going to match those up. Make those stitches kind of kiss each other. We'll put a pin in it. And actually, if I take another pin and take it through that stitching, it should be pretty much equal on the other side. It's okay if I'm off a little bit. Once again, I'm probably going to go for leaving maybe a teeny tiny bit of distance between where I start and where I end. I'm better off with a teeny tiny little hole there than to lap the next stitching into this orange stitching. So we'll go ahead and we'll pin the seam allowance. So now we're ready to sew the second main seam. This is the side seam, and we are going to be starting slightly below, about a 1/4 inch below. I'm going to back stitch almost up to this point, and then I will sew the entire side seam. Now you will notice that when I sewed this, I did end up leaving a little bit of a hole right here. And that's okay. You don't even have to go back and stitch this at all. It's extremely small, but you're better off to leave a teeny tiny hole than lap over, because lapping over is going to leave a pucker. This will not leave a pucker. Even if your seam was off a little bit, you're really not going to have an issue with that. So this is okay. So we're going to remove the pins from the last step. You're going to go to your ironing board and you're going to press your side seam open. When you're done pressing the side seam open, you're going to take your sleeve and you're going to pull your sleeve out. And now those seams will be right sides together also. And what we want to do is we want to pin back the side seam allowance. And by pinning it back, it's going to help get it out of the way so that when we go to sew our sleeve seam, we're not going to get a pucker in the corner. So you're going to take that side seam and fold it back, pin it down, so we've folded back the side seam, pinned it down so it won't flip over, so when we go to sew, we won't run the risk of sewing into the side seam, which would cause a pucker. Our goal is now to sew from this point and sew the sleeve together. We are going to sew it from this side. Okay, so I'm ready to sew my sleeve side seam, but before I go to sew it, I want to show you that I do have my little points right here. These are lined up. So when I go to sew this, this is going to be my sleeve seam. And when I flip this over to put it in a sewing direction, I did reposition the pin because it was on the back side. And I wanted to show you that I still have the pin in here. Once again, that pin is holding back my side seam allowance so it will not get caught in any of my stitching in this area. So I'm going to sew this the same way I did before. I'm going to start about right here. I'm going to sew back about a 1/4 inch. My goal is not to sew into this black stitching. Preference would be to end maybe just slightly below it or leave a slight little hole. And then I will sew the sleeve seam. So as you can see, there is a slight little gap, both on the back and the front, but that's okay. I'm then going to go over to the ironing board, and I'm then going to press my sleeve seam allowance open. So I wanted to show you now that we have a very successful sleeve underarm junction. Technically, at this moment, you're done, except I like to do one more little thing. The last thing I like to do is I like to take the sleeve, the little bit of sleeve seam allowance, and I like to lay it down and tack it into or onto the side seam, arm side seam. I like to tack it down with a little bit of a straight stitch running backwards and forwards. And what that's going to do is it's going to keep that little piece of fabric, which it's the only part that's not overcasted up on the top here. It's going to keep that fabric open and make it a little tidier. So right where my thumbs are where I'm going to tack down. I'm going to put a little bit of a small tack stitch. To do this little tack stitch, I am only stitching through the side seam allowance and the sleeve seam allowance. Put it underneath the presser foot, and I am going to stitch backwards. Then I'm going to stitch forward, but I'm going to kind of pull the fabric a little bit. So I'm going to get a little bit of a V in there. And when I'm done, you can see the little V stitch. So now you can see the completed underarm seam. This is my sleeve seam. This is the side seam. And this is the shoulder arm size seam. And then I have my little tack downs. Let's flip this now to the correct side. And you can see that we have a nice pucker-free underarm. There is the teeniest, tiniest hole. You don't even think about going in there and whip stitching that close. There's absolutely no need to do that. If you really have to, you could. But when everything is all said and done, our sleeve will have a nice 90-degree angle to it with absolutely no puckers. The last final detail that I would recommend is that you press the seam allowance toward the neckline, not toward the sleeve. It's going to want to lay in that direction anyways. And then run an edge stitch along the seam allowance. And don't worry so much about, getting this stitch way down in the corner. You don't need to do that. Whenever I do this, I will use little teeny tiny stitches and then convert to my normal stitch length. So this is the finished result of the inside seam finish for the kimono. So the only thing you have to do now is sew the other sleeve. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and may all of your kimono sleeves have nice right angles to them and no puckers. And I hope this technique works out for you. I've done many, many kimono type jackets, and this by far is the best technique I have found for sewing a kimono type sleeve. and getting it almost perfect.